Hello and welcome to Mid-Maryland Votes. I am your host, Marc Flynn. Here's my co-host,
Ethan Lowen.
and we are here to discuss a topic this week that we find very interesting. You may not find it interesting. Frankly, we don't care. We find it interesting, so we're going to talk about it. And what is it? It's the 2026 Maryland gubernatorial race, i.e., the race for governor of Maryland.
It officially kicked off just last week.
Now it's 2 years away, Ethan. Why should people care?
Well, the what it is that the people that are announcing today are oftentimes ones that are front runners. They oftentimes set the tone of the conversation, what's going to be discussed,
Right.
And now it's off and running. We've started.
That's excellent. So, who is declared so far? Now we know that Governor Moore is very likely to run, although he hasn't put any papers in. He's got plenty of time.
The second half of June of next year, and the general election, of course, is November 3rd of next year.
Okay, so you get the primary and the general. People have a lot of time to declare, but we do have one declaring for the Republican Party, correct?
Yes.
All right. And who was that?
Well, for governor, it is John Myrick for governor, and
Okay.
his lieutenant governor is going to be our very own from Washington County, Brenda Cham.
Well, the candidate for lieutenant governor.
Yes.
All right. And so you're from Washington County. You're familiar with both of these folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So tell us what your rundown is on them both.
Absolutely. So John Myrick is he ran for senator last year, so he is not totally new. He is from Prince George's County. He is a very conservative Republican, and that was his platform as senator. That is his platform as governor. The lieutenant governor candidate that he's chosen is Brenda Cham. She is a prior delegate for Hagerstown, and she actually holds the title of being the first Black Republican woman to be a Republican delegate in Annapolis.
Okay, so they've declared they're going to start running. They're campaigning. Do we know anything about these candidates yet? I mean, they're Republicans, but what level of Republican we're talking about?
Sure. So I think it's safe to say that we know quite a bit about them. I mean, one, because John Myrick did run for Senate, so he obviously went a lot of places, gave a lot of speeches, and made his policies well known. And Brenda Cham, she has obviously been involved in politics for a number of years now. She has a voting record in Annapolis, and so I think it's safe to say that they are both two candidates that are genuine Republican conservatives.
So they're conservative Republicans, which kind of brings up the kind of qualifier, right? So the last election 2 years ago, Governor Moore slaughtered Dan Cox, the Republican candidate. Basically, he won back many of the districts and the counties that Hogan had won previously. Hogan being a Republican governor, unusual. Republican governor of Maryland for 2 terms.
Yes.
The only reason he didn't run again, Hogan, was because Governor Hogan had termed out. The Maryland Constitution says you can only do 2 terms, and then you're out. You got to be out at least 4 years, and then you could run again if you wanted to. So some people consider Hogan to be a rhino. Can you explain that term to us and how it applies to this election?
Yes. A rhino is an acronym that stands for Republican in name only. So in other words, it's something that Republicans, refer to other Republicans who they don't believe are remaining true to the conservative ideals. It's a little bit of a pejorative and a little bit intended to be a bit of an insult, but it has come to be commonly accepted as an accurate designation of a Republican who perhaps is more willing to cross to the other side to make deals.
Yeah.
That is certainly the sort of record that Governor Hogan has set for himself. And if he runs again, as many people suspect that he will run for governor again, that is presumably what he would continue to stand for.
Yeah. So a rhino, as you said, is a pejorative for very conservative Republicans. They consider rhinos to be an insult. And you said pejorative, but some people don't know what that big word means. Okay. So insults, right? And so, being a rhino, for me personally, I love Governor Hogan, and I thought he was an excellent leader in many, many ways. Many Republicans thought he was not. Now, he wasn't perfect. I think, there was some concessions he made that I did not approve of, being a Republican and a moderate. But as a moderate, I can tell you that Governor Hogan governed the way I think that governors should govern. He did reach both sides of the aisle. He was very accommodating. As a matter of fact, the only way that he could possibly win election in a blue state like Maryland is to appeal to Democratic moderates, which is what he did.
Yes, he, in this very divided society that we have, Larry Hogan did actually prove that he has the ability to reach across and to attract voters from the moderate side of the other side of the aisle, and he was able to get quite a bit of legislation done. In many ways, you can easily make the argument that he was a successful governor.
I thought Governor Hogan's last campaign when he won was brilliant. He let people speak for him. His campaign workers went into Baltimore, Prince George's County, places that have high crime and high issues, and they asked people how they felt about Governor Hogan. And to a person that on these, you could see over and over again people saying, "I don't know about the Democrats. I don't know about Democrat, Republican. I could care less. All I know is that I see this guy showed up to help when nobody else was there." With crime, with schools, with different issues, and those campaign ads resonated with people, And I know that people crossed their lines. They a lot of Democrats did vote for, obviously, because he won 2 elections back to back in a predominantly 80% blue state.
And he was the first Republican governor to be back to back a governor since Governor McKeldin, who I believe was the 1940s, 1950s. So it has been quite a long time, quite an accomplishment in that regards. Now, on the flip side, what conservative Republicans would say is that while he certainly has a record of reaching across the aisle, and that is not a bad thing. I don't think there are many people who describe that as bad, but they would point to how over time, even during his candidacy, his time as governor, there are a number of things that did not go in the right direction regarding crime, drugs. The conditions of our public schools did start to degrade during that. So they would point out that him reaching across the aisle was perhaps done at the expense of the some of our other institutions.
Yeah, and also I know a lot of Republicans had issues with how he handled COVID. Governor Hogan was definitely pro-mask. He was pro-distancing. He pretty much endorsed all of Dr. Fauci's issues and decrees. And I know that a lot of Republicans were very disappointed in that. At schools, for instance, the fact that he allowed the schools to be shut down was extremely disappointing to many of the Republicans at that time.
There certainly is a lot of debate and back and forth that is ripe to be done.
Yeah. And the standard old school Republicans, the very conservative MAGAs and so forth, they were very disappointed with Hogan and his performance with COVID, to the point where they would not back the Republican candidate that Hogan endorsed, which was Kelly Schultz. Now, Kelly Schultz ran against Dan Cox for the primary position to run against Governor Moore later on. That was a very interesting campaign, had a lot of ripples in it that many people may not be aware of. Kelly Schultz was endorsed by Hogan. She is a very competent legislator, but of course she was branded as a rhino herself. Interesting parts of that campaign.
Yes, and what was very interesting from my perspective is that I would have expected Kelly Schultz to have done won. I kind of had her as the person who I thought most likely to win, but it did not go like that at all. It was Dan Cox and Gordana Schiffinelli, his lieutenant governor candidate, who actually won the primaries by quite a wide margin.
Now, some people would say that his pick for lieutenant governor was actually stronger. How would you feel about that?
I think that in hindsight, looking at it, that Gordana had a presence when it came to public speaking.
Can you describe her? Because a lot of people don't understand her or who she is.
Sure. My understanding of her background is that she actually is a survivor of the attempted Holocaust that occurred in Bosnia, back in the 1990s. and the man that she would eventually marry, she met there. He was an American soldier. They did get married. She has since become a mother, a business owner, and eventually
A U.S. citizen.
a U.S. citizen. And then she saw issues that with the public schools, interestingly, as so many people do that get involved in politics. And she started out as a school board member in her county. One thing led to another, and then she was a candidate for lieutenant governor.
Isn't it interesting that many immigrants to our country who come to the country to build it up and to come to legally and become U.S. citizens, many of them become members of the Republican Party. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, and what she described, because I heard one of her speeches, and she talked about how when she had first come to America, and she still spoke with a very heavy accent, did not speak very much English, and just an experience that she had, I believe, was at a gas station. It was a very simple experience, for us Americans that we would very much take for granted, but for her, coming from another country and the way that so much of the rest of the world operates, it just made all the difference to her, and she just felt very blessed to be in America and to be in the process of becoming an American citizen.
Yeah, I mean that's the general overall feeling of most legal immigrants to our country. They love America, they love being here in America, and they stand up proud. So, one interesting wrinkle that we haven't talked about is this: when Dan Cox was running for in the primary against Kelly Schultz, Dan Cox had some very interesting donors to his campaign. They were the Democratic Governors Association. They gave over $1.5 million to Dan Cox's campaigns. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that the answer is fairly clear. They obviously believed that he was the weaker candidate for the general election against Wes Moore and Aruna Miller. And they wanted to do their part to ensure that he won and Kelly Schultz did not progress.
So just for our viewers can understand what we're talking about, donations were made in the millions of dollars to Dan Cox in the primary to beat his Republican rival, Kelly Schultz, by Democratic political organizations, because they believed that Dan Cox would be easier to beat than Kelly Schultz in the Maryland gubernatorial election and on election day. And that was absolutely brilliant. I mean, because Dan Cox represents a percentage of people in Maryland, more of your hardcore Republicans, and they came out to vote for him, but he was soundly beat by Governor Moore.
He was. And it really, I think what it kind of brings to the forefront, if for the Republican Party, is the debate for them to decide, do they believe that holding to their traditional values is the right thing to do? Or has society reached a point, especially in a state like Maryland? Obviously, if we're talking in a red state, it would be a very different conversation. But in a state such as Maryland, in order to succeed and get at least some of the Republican priorities across, should the Republican Party stay very tight to its traditional values, or does it need to go the route of, say, a Governor Hogan or a Kelly Schultz, and actually be more willing to bend on some of those priorities in order to reach across to the other side and get at least some Republican priorities through? Because I think that one thing that can be said about Larry Hogan is that while certainly there were tons of Democratic priorities and initiatives that were achieved, he did get some Republican priorities achieved as well.
Yes, he did, and he balanced the budget, which was hard to do in a tax and spend state such as Maryland. He balanced the budget. We had a budget surplus with Governor Hogan when he left office. We don't have that anymore. As a matter of fact, Governor Moore has, done a really good job of spending all that money and billions of dollars in the future. So, but to your point, that is a big debate. I mean, Republicans feel like there's a big camp that says, let's stay on our morals. Let's go with what we got. And that would work possibly if you weren't in a completely blue state. Okay. You are lucky to churn it purple if you are a Republican. All right. But thinking that the state of Maryland is going to go bright red anytime soon is, in my opinion, is just, it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous thought.
Mhm.
Kelly Schultz was the better candidate for governor. Even the Democrats knew it, and they set a trap. They funded a campaign they knew would likely be beat, and they were correct. They played chess, and the Republicans were playing checkers.
And that is certainly one way to look at it. Because if you think about it, what if Kelly Schultz had won? Well, we probably would not be, in all likelihood, I think I can say with confidence, we wouldn't be headed towards 16% deficits as we are currently with just 2 years with that change. However, on the flip side, to take a look at what the kind of one of the larger points that conservative Republicans would make is that if you look at this last election, so not 2 years ago when Dan Cox was running against Wes Moore, but this last presidential election a few months ago, the conservatives in the school boards made quite a bit of progress. In other words, on the grassroots level, you can make the argument from the hardcore conservative, traditional conservative point of view that continuing to work grassroots really does work. It really does register with individuals across all parties.
No, I agree 100%. I think that there are counties in Maryland that are clearly run in a conservative fashion that I enjoy. I mean, Frederick is basically the county that I live in, and it is basically, a purple county. I mean, you got a lot of Democrats, you got a lot of Republicans. They live harmoniously for the most part. The city of Frederick is an excellent city, a wonderful city with lots to offer. But we are seeing more and more of the tax and spend philosophy. And as people have moved up from Montgomery County, they brought their politics with them. What used to be a red Frederick is now, purple. At best purple. We've had two county executives in a row that were blue, and it's likely we're going to see that in the future in this county.
Yes, and I believe it was at the last county commissioner meeting for Frederick just a couple of weeks ago, where it was a point of discussion that it is now 1/3 of the residents of Frederick County are behind on their property tax bills, and just speaking to the effects of what happens as you just continue to push tax and spend policies.
So, for our viewers, understand what he just said. Over 1/3 of Frederick County residents are behind on paying their property taxes, and those taxes are going up.
Yeah.
They're going up. Under the blueprint for Maryland, Frederick County will now assume the retirement benefits for all teachers in the county. That is going to add even more to your taxes. So, look, I'm a fiscally conservative man. I'm a little more liberal on social policies. So I'm definitely a moderate Republican or a liberal Democrat, however you want to see it. I'm sorry, a conservative Democrat. But the bottom line is that we have got to find government that works. I will vote for whoever I think can make it work, Republican or Democrat. So in the upcoming election, we've got some choices to make. We don't know who's going to declare yet, but there is a high likelihood that Governor Hogan, former Governor Hogan, who had a failed attempt at being senator?
Yes.
What was his campaign? I can't remember.
It was against Angela Alsobrooks for senator.
Right. And he lost fairly well. I mean, it wasn't like it was that close, was it?
I don't believe it was that terribly close. It wasn't that far.
Yeah. So he lost that election, but he is very likely to throw his hat in the ring for this future governor position. Isn't that correct?
It does appear the rumor mill, of course, is a swirl, and it does seem that many people expect that he will announce to run for governor, just based off of not just his past record in 2 elections as governor, but the fact that it was a very strong showing in a Senate race. And what it appears to be is that one of the reasons that Angela Alsobrooks won and is now the senator for the state is that there was a very strong messaging that the Democrats had where they told former Democrat or Democrats that had voted for Larry Hogan 2 other times before that this is not a choice between Larry Hogan and a Democrat, because obviously they had already chosen Larry Hogan. But this is actually about who is going to be in control of the Senate. Is it going to be Democrats or Republicans? So it's not about whether or not you do or don't approve of Larry Hogan. That seems to have worked very well. So if that was the reason that Larry Hogan lost his run to be senator, then there's every reason to believe that he would continue to get the same number of votes as he had previously if he was running for governor.
Right. I agree. I think he's got a much stronger case for being governor than senator for those very reasons you just talked about. The Democrats did an excellent job framing the election between Hogan and was it Allstott?
Also Brooks.
Also Brooks. They did a very good job of framing this election between those two as being for control of the Senate. So people who would normally vote for Hogan, who liked Hogan, who enjoyed him as governor and thought he did a good job, even Democrats, voted against him because of, I believe, because of the fight going on to control the Senate in the last presidential election.
Mm-hmm. And another election that I think really shows the dynamics, and why there are these various entities throughout the state that have legitimate arguments to make, is that you can look at the election between Neil Parrott and April McLean Delaney for the congressional seat that covers, Washington County and Frederick County down to Montgomery County. And Neil Parrott has been an underdog for 3 consecutive elections. However, in each election, as a conservative Republican, much like Dan Cox, much like John Myrick and Brenda Cham, he came closer each of his 3 elections. Again, making the case while being dramatically outspent and having a Democrat to Republican ratio that is greatly against him. The fact that he has been approaching victory more with each election, again, is another thing to look at and say, all right, does this grassroots movement, is there really continuous strength? Will it continue? What is making it run? And that, I think, is going to be perhaps the largest debate in this upcoming primary elections within the Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to have to decide, right? There's going to be choices to make. So as Republicans, you're going to have to decide, do I want grassroots, deep red candidates, or do I want candidates who are more towards the purple spectrum who could possibly win an election against Democrats in a blue-held state?
And that is something that we will see how that turns out.
Well, it's going to be exciting. I'm sure we're going to do a few more podcasts on this possible point. I'm interested to see who's going to throw their hat in the ring. I clearly, the Democrats will not run against Governor Moore if he decides to run for re-election, which is highly likely. So we're looking at who is going to be able to run against Governor Moore in a successful manner.
Yes.
Do you think that there's some disillusionment on the side of the Democrats with Governor Moore's performance? I don't think his performance has been horrible. I think he's done an adequate job, but I think that we as a state could be much stronger. But what is your overall feeling?
So the polls, and I'm referring to national polls at this point, but the polls are showing that the disillusionment among Democrats is actually at a record high, going back to the polls that began from, the oldest seems to be NBC, going back to 1990. There are record low levels of Democrat support for their own party. Whereas Republicans, while the support is not the strongest of all time, it is solid and far higher than the Democrats. So the amount of disillusionment amongst Democrats seems to be far, far higher than the amount of disillusionment amongst Republicans.
The most recent poll, and it wasn't directed at Governor Moore, but Democratic politicians in general. This is a poll taken by Democrats for Democrats. Okay, it was a CNN poll. So yeah, by Democrats. That poll revealed that only 23% of registered Democrats felt confidence in their Democratic leaders and the way they were taking their country, their counties, and their states.
Yes.
That's alarming for Democrats. That should be extremely alarming for Democrats.
And it does raise the question, is it possible that it could get to the point that even in Maryland, that Democratic elections become an uphill battle?
Yeah. No, and you could be seeing the swing of Maryland going back to a red state, which it had been for years. So that's an interesting thing to watch. We will keep our fingers on the pulse of this election. You can tune in here for more information from us. Hey, if you like our podcast, please like us and follow us on Facebook and also on our YouTube page. Ethan, what do you got to say?
It's fun talking. I hope everyone got as much out of it as we did, and have a great week.
We enjoy our podcast. We hope you did too. Join us next week for another topic, and we'll see you.